Hello, this is Crystal Racing here. I hope you are all doing well. I hope you're all safe and I hope you're all having a good winter. But of course, this is part one of my post-season 2020 driver rankings for this season, starting off with 11th place at Esteban Ocon. 2020 has been a very middling season for Esteban Ocon. In other words, he has been perfectly bang average throughout most of this season. And at least on about 3 or 4 occasions, we have heard radio messages from his team telling him to let Daniel Ricciardo go past because, in terms of both qualifying and in race pace, Esteban Ocon has been well and truly heavily dominated. He has lost a qualifying battle 15-2 to Ricciardo, and in addition, he has also only managed to beat Ricciardo throughout this whole year, only 3 times in the race. Although, of course, he can use an excuse for the fact that he was forced to retire 4 times throughout this season. However, that does not take away from the fact that Daniel Ricciardo scored roughly twice the number of points he scored, and arguably you could say that Esteban Ocon did pretty much cause Renault to end up finishing 5th and not be able to fully challenge both Racing Point and McLaren, who only finished a few more, about 20 odd points ahead of them, in a season where the fight for the 3rd place in the Constructors' Championship has been very tight. Next up, it is Lance Stroll in 12th place, a massive, major improvement for the Canadian driver. And I have to say, I have been somewhat impressed this season by Lance Stroll. Looking at Lance Stroll's result, he started the season off very well, where after the Italian Grand Prix, he was quite some way ahead of his teammate in the driver's standing. I think at one point he was somewhere up around in 4th place, behind the main three of Bottas, Hamilton and Verstappen. But of course, the Italian Grand Prix was somewhat disappointing in that he had a good chance of potentially winning the race, since of course he started right behind Hamilton and Kimi Raikkonen, but of course blew it with a terrible start, allowing Gasly and Sainz to fight for the win. Unfortunately, after a strong start to the season, of course, memorably with his best performance coming out of Hungary in the wet conditions, and of course another strong performance in Spain where he finished 4th ahead of teammate Sergio Perez once again, he then had a run of 5 races where he scored 0 points. Of course, at Tuscany, his car spun because something broke and he crashed into the barriers. Russia, he got taken out by Leclerc, was forced to withdraw from the Nürburgring due to the virus. Portugal saw him clash with Lando Norris, I beg your pardon. And then, of course, he struggled like mad at Imola. However, he picked himself up at Turkey and took his maiden pole position, becoming one of the 10 youngest drivers to take pole position in Formula 1 history. However, strategy and car damage meant he finished down in 9th. Retired at Bahrain because he got taken out on the first lap by Kvyat, then took his 3rd career podium at Sakir, although of course he was well and truly overshadowed by Perez, and then ended the season with a very mediocre 10th place, so, which arguably costed Racing Point the 3rd place in the championship, but of course Perez's retirement did not help matters. Coming up next, it is 13th place, George Russell. Now, some of you may find this ranking somewhat controversial with George Russell down in 13th, but I have to say, even though, yes, he outqualified Nicholas Latifi 16 times to 0, I have to say, in terms of race pace, George Russell hasn't been that great in the races this season, apart from, of course, that brief race, that one race he did at Sakir for Mercedes. But in terms of the race battle, Latifi managed to beat him twice, finish ahead of him at least twice during this season, and whilst of course Russell has managed to usually be consistently the faster driver, I have to say at Monza and of course particularly Imola, I think George Russell really did blow it quite badly. Yes, I know he was taken out of the race at the Nürburgring by a certain Kimi Raikkonen and possibly could have scored his maiden points, but the thing is though, when he crashed out at Imola, he would have at least finished ninth had he just kept his car on the road. Of course, as it turned out to be, instead it ended up being the two Alfa Romeos of Kimi and Giovinazzi who finished ninth and 10th, which means of course his team, Williams, have for the first time ever in Formula 1 history have ended the season with 0 points using a car of their own make. But having said that though, his performance at Sakir was absolutely sublime and a genuine glimpse of his potential to become a top driver in many years to come if he ever gets to see a Mercedes. So there's hope, but I have to say 13th place does actually seem quite reasonable. Next up, in 14th place, it is none other than Sebastian Vettel in his final season for the Scuderia. It has been, frankly, an absolute nightmare of a season. Throughout this year, he's only out-qualified teammate Charles Leclerc 3 times, and frankly, as we all know, Sebastian Vettel has complained many times about the fact he cannot drive the car does not suit his style of driving, the rear end is too unstable and all that, but nevertheless, to be consistently half a second off your teammates' pace in qualifying is alarming, and he only managed to finish in the points 7 times throughout the year. Of course, yes, he was unfortunate with what happened at the second race in Austria, and of course what happened at the Italian Grand Prix with his brakes failing, but the fact of the matter is, Vettel has had a very miserable season. Only about, I'm trying to count, 3 times has he managed to finish in front of Charles Leclerc in the races. And, you know what, and the fact of the matter is, I think Vettel is probably glad he's now leaving Ferrari, because let's be honest, if he continued any longer, he would probably just spend the whole time getting beat by Leclerc for however long he stays at that team. But I will say though, his performance at Turkey was absolutely fantastic. It was the old Sebastian Vettel all over again. And yes, whilst he did get lucky with Leclerc bottling it on the final lap, meaning that Vettel nicked in for his only podium of the season, let's not forget, numerous spins throughout the year at Austria, the British Grand Prix, another spin at the Nürburgring, and then I think another early spin at Bahrain. I mean, I'm pretty certain, whilst Sebastian Vettel will always have Ferrari this whole, I'm pretty sure he's now glad to be going, because let's be honest, Ferrari are a joke. And yes, I know, you're probably looking at the screen thinking, is this an error? No, it's not wrong. 15th place, Valtteri Bottas. I know. How can I rank the championship runner-up all the way down in 15th? Well, let me explain. The last 3 races before, of course, Bahrain were an absolute disaster. His performances at Turkey, where he kept response 6 times, I gave him 3 out of 10. And then, of course, his 2 races at Bahrain, I gave him 5 out of 10 because, of course, he picked up damage early on at the first race in Bahrain. And then, of course, in the second race in Bahrain, he was absolutely slapped by George Russell, who, of course, was driving his first ever race for the Silver Arrows. But throughout this season, I've only given Valtteri Bottas 10 out of 10 once, because the fact of the matter is he has been so poor throughout this year. Like, consistently, I've been giving him 8s and 7s, because even when he won at Russia, I was just sort of very underwhelmed, feeling like, he beat Max Verstappen by only about 6 or 7 seconds. And I thought, you've only won because Lewis picked up those penalties for his practice start shenanigans. But, his race at Monza was just the most depressingly poor performance. I gave him 2 out of 10. What the hell, mate? The worst start ever. Dropped down to 6th. I mean, he was fighting Ricciardo for position. And at no point during that race did he look like he was ever going to make his way to the front, even after Lewis Hamilton was given the penalty for coming into the pit lane when it was short. And I have to say, I really am so disappointed in Valtteri this season. The number of excuses he's come up with, that poor start at Hungary where he blamed the start lights for going out too quickly. He's moaning about his black overalls at Spain, saying they were too sweaty whilst he got beat by Verstappen. Then, of course, believing he had a puncture at the start at the Italian Grand Prix, even though he clearly had no problems on his car or any damage. Then, of course, even when he won the race at Russia, he blamed a bee for hitting his helmet for the fact he failed to overtake Hamilton at turn 1. The list of excuses just do not end with Valtteri Bottas. And, his performances in the second half of the season, goodness me. Of course, we also must not forget he looked up, was leading the race at the Nürburgring. And then, of course, a power unit failure meant he retired. Yes, I know he's had bad luck on a moment, such as his tyre blowing out at the British Grand Prix, meaning he finished down in 11th. But the fact is, though, on the last lap, he had a chance to overtake Sebastian Vettel and did not, because he's so conservative in his racecraft. He's so ponderous and cautious. He keeps talking about how he's, upping his game and he's going to increase the pressure on Lewis Hamilton, but these sort of pathetic performances tell me he's got no hope of ever coming close to Lewis Hamilton. But he does still make a very nice number 2 for Mercedes, who, as long as they can continue producing dominant cars, will never have to sweat and worry about their drivers fighting each other like it was between Hamilton and Rosberg. 16th place, it is Kevin Magnussen. Very sad to see Kevin go after this season, but of course, as with Haas, we all know they're in a very bad situation financially, with Gene Haas allegedly losing, having a debt in the 9-figure sums, which is like over $100 million, pounds, or whatever currency you like to use. Throughout this season, I know it sounds harsh to rank Kevin Magnussen down here, but it's really hard to rank both Kevin Magnussen and, of course, Grosjean, because their car's development has been so bad, and, I just found it almost impossible to rank the pair of them. I would admit, I gave Kevin Magnussen a 4 out of 10 for his performances at Britain and the 70th anniversary races, but when it was the car, when it was Magnussen having a nightmare, it was just, at this point, his career's come to an end. He took his final points finish at Hungary, finishing 10th, but of course never scored again. And it was a superb performance, but I've got nothing else to say. And I feel really sorry to see K-Mag on his way out, but that's all I want to say. 17th place, Nicholas Latifi. A fairly solid debut season, I may say, despite not scoring a point. But I will say, though, I have been impressed by his consistency, finishing 11th 3 times, 11th on his debut in Austria, keeping himself out of trouble, waiting for others to screw up and run and get into collision with other drivers or pick up mechanical failures. He retired 3 times throughout the season, but the fact of the matter is, despite being out-qualified 16-0 throughout the year by George Russell, at Sakir, of course, when George Russell went to Mercedes, Nicholas Latifi went on to out-qualify a teammate for the first time in Jack Aitken. So well done for that, getting that notch on your belt. And I think Nicholas Latifi can be optimistic about progressing further in 2021, so well done. 18th place, and yes, I know this seems harsh, it's Antonio Giovinazzi, and boy oh boy do I have some quite strong condemnation for Giovinazzi this season, because whilst of course Alfa Romeo will have a car that's a lot worse than it was in 2019, I've got to say it, Giovinazzi race performances have not quite been as good as his electric qualifying performances, where of course he beat Kimi 99 2 times to 8. Of course he won the qualifying battle in the final round at Abu Dhabi. However, and I will say this, Kimi Raikkonen has beaten Giovinazzi 7 times, has finished in front of him 7 times in the races. In the 7 races they finished together, which is about, 13 races, Giovinazzi has lost a race battle 17 to 7 to 6, I beg your pardon. Although, yes, of course, he scored the same number of points as Kimi, 4, but of course, as you may know, of course, he finishes behind Kimi because, of course, Kimi took 9th place twice and, of course, on countback. But the fact of the matter is, in terms of overall race pace, Giovinazzi constantly falls back. And whilst, yes, I will say his ability to pick up positions off the start has been incredibly impressive, he generally doesn't do a lot much else after like the first 2 or 3 laps. He just sort of stays where he is. He doesn't really get into too many fights with the cars, and of course he crashed out at Belgium in what was a very embarrassing mistake. And there's still silly errors here and there, and of course he whacked into Kimi at the start at Bahrain. It's all these sort of silly things are really sort of counting against him, really progressing. And I know it's harsh, but the fact of the matter is, there's always that sense he could do a lot more. Please, Giovinazzi, just please start doing a bit better than this, because I know you're better than this, come on. And of course, like for example, at the Nürburgring he did finish 10th. He should have beat Grosjean, and he arguably should have beat Hulkenberg. I mean, yes, I know he did pretty well to look after tyres at Imola, but the thing is, though, again, he doesn't really make his strategies work, and when he does get that advantage over Kimi, he doesn't really kick on as much as he should do, and I know it's really harsh, but please, Giovinazzi, you've got to do more than this. And of course, in 19th place, it is none other than the very unlucky Romain Grosjean. Scored only once during the season, taking 9th place at the Nürburgring, meaning that Haas finished the season at 9th place in the Constructors' Championship, and he finishes in front of Kevin Magnussen in the driver's standing. However, early on in the season, Romain Grosjean was getting up to all sorts of nonsense again, getting involved in silly accidents, spinning off the road, chopping in front of people at the 2 races at Silverstone, going across the bollards at Russia, and all sorts of silly stuff. But having said that, though, I will say there were some decent performances throughout the year, such as him finishing 12th at Monza, and he did an amazing job just to get the car back on the road at the Mugello Grand Prix. He finished 12th and last, but because of the severe damage he had after being involved in the first lap incident, just to be able to rejoin the race, stay out of that big pile-up involving Giovinazzi, Sainz, and Latifi and others, for me, Grosjean has actually driven the best I've seen him in the past 2 or 3 years, to be honest. But unfortunately, with the state that car is in, he never really stood a chance of being able to show people of how much he's improved. The car is just a joke, and then of course in his last 2 races as an F1 driver, he got taken out on the last with 10 laps to go by Nicholas Latifi, and then of course that horrific accident at Bahrain, which of course he's still in rehab for because of the burns to his hands. And get well soon, Grosjean. And of course, from rumours I've heard, Grosjean will be doing a farewell test with an old Mercedes in next month or maybe February. So all the best of luck, Roman. You took 10 podiums at your time in Lotus, and you've done an awful lot for Haas in the 5 years you've been there. So and for those of you wondering what score I gave him in his last ever race at Bahrain, I gave him 10 out of 10 for getting out of the fire alive and well. Because as far as I'm concerned, a driver's safety is what I care about far more than what they achieve on track. But now it's time for me to crown my reject of the season, and it can only be Alex Albon. Yes, I know things have been against Alex this season. he has been very much given the number 2 treatment in terms of Max Verstappen being given the best parts. But the fact of the matter is, throughout this season, Alex Albon has been far too inconsistent. And the fact of the matter is, he has finished down in 7th place in the driver's standings, which is frankly unacceptable for a driver driving a car that has finished 2nd in the constructor standings. Yes, I know it's not. Red Bull have a car that you could arguably is somewhere between being a top car and an upper midfield car, because the pace advantage Mercedes have had has averaged somewhere around 6 to 7 tenths of a second. But for me, though, when you look at a list of drivers, Albon has finished behind. He has finished behind Perez, Ricciardo, and he's finished on countback behind Carlos Sainz, whose McLaren has been much slower than the Red Bull. I mean, that is not good enough. That is so poor. I'm looking at the list of all his performances throughout the year. Yes, he started the season off well. He benefited from the safety car at Austria and could have won the race had it not been for Lewis Hamilton spinning around, which I gave 9 out of 10 to Alex Albon, because he actually did impress me with his feistiness that day. But from that point on, the next 6 races were really quite average. I mean, I gave 6 out of 10 for his second race at Austria, where he finished 4th, because, Perez was catching him. I gave him, what was it, 8 out of 10 for his performance at Hungary, but he finished down in 5th. Then I gave him 5 out of 10 for his performance in the first race at Bray, because he qualified so far down the grid and only got 8th place, whilst of course Max Verstappen was up there challenging for the win. And then of course he finished 5th a week later at the 70th anniversary race, giving him 7 out of 10. Then of course 5 out of 10 for his next performance at Spain, where he finished down in 8th, whilst Max was up in 2nd place. I mean, come on. And then I gave him 6 out of 10 for his performance at Spa, where he finished 6th, whilst once again Max was right up there with the Mercedes. Then I gave him his worst one of the worst scores of the season at Monza, 1 out of 10 for finishing 15th. At Tuscany, though, in the Mugello Grand Prix, where he earned his maiden podium, I gave him 8 out of 10, because, well done for getting his maiden podium there, but at the restarts, he kept losing positions all the time, and he had to keep overtaking people. So I wasn't really sure whether it was because he actually drove well or whether his car was doing the work for him. He then finished 10th at Russia, where I gave him 5 out of 10, because of course he had the grid penalty for his gearbox change and all that, but for me it was a really poor race. And then of course he had an absolute nightmare at the Nürburgring, where I gave him 1 out of 10 for the fact that he took off Danny Kvyat's front wing. He got involved in some other incident where he hit another car, and then of course apparently something broke in his car, causing him to retire. But of course many people speculated he was pulled in to essentially have him benched because he was struggling that much. And then of course at Portugal he finished 12th behind Kimi Räikkönen. I gave him 2 out of 10. I mean, what the hell was that performance? He was just so tentative, so cautious in the damp conditions. I mean, I know it's a new track, but come on, Alex. I mean, Max Verstappen finished up in 3rd place. I know the Red Bull wasn't that good around it, but still, please get the points, man. And then, of course, he had an absolute nightmare at Imola, where at this point I just felt so bad for him that I refused to give him any point score, so that instead of having his scores divided by 17, his scores for this season will be divided by 16. But of course, that unfortunately hasn't saved him, because I mean, he's just picked up so many low scores, I'm afraid, for myself. At least 6 times this season he has picked up a score of 5 or less. That is a real disaster, and I will admit, most of his best scores have really been 4 8s and a 9 throughout this season. Of course, at Turkey, the seeds of recovery began to appear for Alex. A semi-decent qualifying 4th, was, of course, Max mixed out on pole. Finished 7th in the race after spinning twice, but at least, he was competing right up there with the likes of Hamilton and Vettel. I will give him that. And I gave him a 7.5 out of 10 for that performance. Then at Bahrain, he picked up his second podium of the season, where I gave him 8 out of 10. Although, of course, he was very fortunate to profit from Perez's engine failure late on. Then I gave him 6.5 out of 10 for finishing 6th at Sakir because, whilst he had an atrocious qualifying down in 12th, at least in the race he recovered slightly. But having said that, though, there were 2 racing points on the podium, so it was very much a case of, well, at least you're doing slightly better, Alex, but you really should be doing a lot better. And then, of course, he ended the season on a high note at Abu Dhabi, an 8 out of 10 performance when he finished 4th, and was all over the gearbox of Lewis Hamilton towards the end of the race. And, I kind of felt a bit sorry for him not getting a podium in the last race of the season, because all weekend long he just looks so much better. I mean, arguably I could have given him 9 out of 10, but in many ways he should be performing like that way more often. I mean, had Alex Albon performed like he did in the last 4 races throughout this season, I would have absolutely no problems with Alex Albon having a seat at Red Bull next season, because of course we all know he's there to be their number 2 driver, and of course to please the Thai owners who own about 51% of the shares of the team. But I'm very much firmly in the Perez in camp at the moment. Albon, I think, probably could well benefit from a year in the Super Formula Series in Japan, where he'll get away from the F1 circus and the level of pressure that's put on him by people like Herbert Marko and all that. And, if Perez, slips up, he can always jump back in when he need him. So, thank you for watching part 1 of this video by Crystal Racing, and I'll see you again next time.